So there are solutions, but they have to be really big. They have to be bold. They have to be comprehensive. We can't noodle around the edges. We can't continue to piecemeal our way to solving the biggest challenges. And housing, in a way, is the biggest challenge because it affects everything. It affects our social well-being, the economic future of the region, which of course cannot function without available, strong, healthy workforce. And it affects the social well-being of everybody that is here. And I think the third thing I left out there, the environment. We can't turn our backs on where we end up in terms of climate change and in terms of local threats. As those fires come closer and closer, we're going to see a whole nother level of vulnerability. We need to solve all these things simultaneously. So, with a little bit of modesty, I will say, here is a solution. Well, here is the problem. And it's been articulated, and I'm not going to go back into it, but where I live in Berkeley, the homeless are everywhere. The tragedy is in our face. And the idea that we can't cope with this and cope with what drives it breaks my heart as somebody who grew up here in a place that was always had the demeanor of optimism and a notion that no matter what the challenge, we could always fix it. You know, it's great to build jobs, but if we don't build housing, you know the jobs cannot continue to expand, and they will move. So here are some of the issues that we have to think about when we think about the housing supply. Just land. We know, you think, quite frankly, especially in the Inner Bay Area, that we've run out of land. Maybe we need to go over the hill. Maybe we need to go out into the Central Valley. Land supply, the land is there. We just don't make it available for housing. And that is one of the great tricks that we need to look at. There's always neighborhood opposition. I have my place in my community. I don't want it to change. The entitlement costs, whether it's going through CEQA or year after year of public hearings in the local jurisdiction, those all add costs, add friction to a machine that has to move very quickly now. The fiscal impact to cities. You know, you've all heard of fiscal zoning. Cities want commercial, they want businesses, they want high tax base land use, and they sure don't want housing where they have to pay for services, police, fire, schools, utilities, parks. There's a negative to actually adding people to your community when you look at the way we've structured our taxes in the state of California ever since Prop 13. We have to subsidize affordable housing. The question is how much? How much of a burden is there? How affordable can we make workforce housing for lower and middle income households so that we bring more people out of that affordable category? Community services, I mentioned. You can't build the kind of housing that we need. Couple million statewide deficit and another 1.5 million needed over the next 7 years. 3.5 million housing units. They don't come just with a garage and an apron. They need all the community services with it and transportation. How are we going to get around? Can we continue to sprawl and think the car is the answer? Is that viable economically or environmentally? The answer is obviously no. So location matters. If we're thinking about the Bay Area, where should we be putting this housing? And there are three prototypical kinds of places. There's urban world, suburban world, and compact. San Ramon and the eastern parts of our region functioned much like most of America for the last 50 years. New housing went in low-density subdivisions to the periphery, and people commuted back in. It's a paradigm built on the car, the shopping mall, the office park, and the cul-de-sac. in a way it became the American dream, but it's no longer attainable for most people, and it's certainly not sustainable in terms of the environment. We had historic streetcar suburbs, and they left a great urban pattern of mixed-use walkable communities that can and should be better served by transit, that were closer in. And in a way, I believe this is the model we need to go back to. Our most urban places, downtown San Jose, downtown San Francisco, certainly offer a really important paradigm. But there's only so much of that we can do. When you compare these different kinds of neighborhoods by every measure, we can no longer afford the sprawl. As a matter of fact, if you think of the collapse in '08, it wasn't just about the banks and subprime loans. It was that we built too much of the wrong kind of housing in the wrong place, too far away, too expensive to commute from, that basically led to an implosion of an oversupply of something that didn't work for who we'd really become. So here's a map of jobs housing balance in the Bay Area. We expect people to commute across the Bay because San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Clara have a jobs imbalance, which we've articulated. And of course, we continue to build the jobs. You're not stopping. I think I noticed some of the data in this earlier slideshow about that. But of course, with a dearth of housing, the costs are out of control. So in my office, we decided to do a thought experiment. Einstein was always into these thought experiments. The what if, what would this result in? And since I grew up in Palo Alto, I knew El Camino really well. El Camino was the, let's see, there's a technical term, the shithole of our community. It was where nobody actually really wanted to be. And yet it was the ribbon, the historic ribbon, that tied all the communities together. And yet it adds no social value, no economic value right now. 43 miles. How many pieces of land on that strip are there that could be converted into mixed use? Look at the configuration here. Surface parking lots, single-story buildings. Amazon is eating all this stuff. It no longer has a place in the retail constellation. It's underutilized land, and yet cities don't want to rezone it for mixed use because they're afraid of bringing in more housing. But in a way, it is the ideal place for mixed use infill. How much can we get? Well, if it looked like this, and I think we are actually up to creating places of this character, which would be housing over ground floor shops. We could go from environments that look like this to environments that look like this. This is not a wild utopia. It's already being built. Menlo Park is already rezoned and built along El Camino. Redwood City is doing it now. There are some communities which I will disparage. Of course, we'll say, not us. We only want the jobs. But to get a unified grand boulevard, a place actually you want to be, that you can walk and ride a bike and go downstairs for a cup of coffee and do some shopping in some small local institutions and have affordable housing above. Completely viable, a proven concept. As a matter of fact, 15 years ago, we rezoned University Avenue in Berkeley, which was, by the way, the ribbon of crime for our city. These derelict strips, of course, are where crime happens the most. So just another data point in terms of another problem we could solve simultaneously. And of course, over time, this has given way to this. And you may say, well, that's alien. But at least, unlike SB 50, which has just gone by the wayside, we're not invading single-family neighborhoods. We're not tearing down residential apartment buildings or displacing single-family houses in order to build more housing. The hypothesis here is, let's just start with commercial land and commercial strip land. Land that's just lining 6- and 4-lane arterials, where the mobility enhancements can be placed, where we're not driving new households into stable neighborhoods that will be out with pitchforks to protect the character of their place. More about that later. So what if you took this chunk of El Camino and did infill? What would happen? With our software, we're able to identify every parcel that has these characteristics: commercial zoning, low density development, fronting on a arterial. And we come up with the capacity to build 250,000 households on El Camino. Now, I don't think that's actually the full solution, because I think we have to think about the whole Bay Area, not just the needs of Silicon Valley. But it gives you a sense the order of magnitude here is big enough to really make a difference. And the politics are benign enough, because it doesn't invade single-family residential areas, that you could, with a few fights — there's nothing you can do in California without fighting — but with some fights, you can imagine that this could become acceptable. We're not touching your residential neighborhoods. We're fixing the ugliest part of your community. And by the way, by every measure, whether it's water consumption, energy, the amount of driving people do, greenhouse gas emissions, transportation costs, which are well over 20% for most working households, it's approaching the cost of housing. And when you put the two together, because they're linked by location, you have well over 50% of household expense going into those two categories. So getting a place where they can travel less and have more affordable housing is a double win, or multiple win. So let's take that idea and spread it across the whole Inner Bay Area. All of a sudden, you go from 43 miles of opportunity to 534 miles. And you get a network of places that enhance every community and connect communities to each other and provide places for young people and households that don't necessarily want a cul-de-sac and a big backyard, and even if they did, probably don't get to afford it, but are happy to live on an exciting street where there's stuff happening at their doorstep, and where, and I'll get to this, they can go out onto their street and get on the next generation of transit, which has to be a big part of this. So these are the computer models, renderings — they're a little hard to read at this distance — of all the parcels. It's distributed. There's no one big place, one big solution. There's no single project. There's no single subsidy strategy. It's dispersed. And if these parcels, as of right, had zoning for housing plus ground floor shops, the private sector would go right ahead and build it. There's every reason to believe, given that whenever one of these parcels comes available for that kind of mixed use, it goes ahead if it isn't stopped by the local government. So this is not something that has to be subsidized into being. It just has to be permitted into being. And the interesting thing about the 2 million units that this larger domain of 543 linear miles of strip would enable is that it distributes itself just about perfectly. 1.2 million of that potential sits in Santa Clara alone, right where you want it, at the epicenter of the jobs housing imbalance. And it knits together a whole community in a way that makes it more coherent and makes people more mobile. This is fire and flooding hazard. We need to think about where we grow in terms of climate change impacts. It's not going away. I'm already frightened for this year as we head into a dry period again. So consolidating. I guess the real message here is that infill is the answer, and we have these ribbons that can become a network of urbanism that enhances all the communities around them. So if you lived near El Camino or Stevens Creek Boulevard in a nice subdivision, and you built your ancillary unit, and you put your solar collector on the roof, and you got your electric car, and you did all the right things, you would also be able to walk to a street that is more than just automobile congestion. Maybe it's actually a place you want to ride a bike and or go shopping again. This is the San Jose area, a very robust opportunity. We've done the same kind of analysis for LA. This is a strategy that works throughout the state of California. And in a way, reinventing the Strip is a solution for all of the United States. We started in the 50s and 60s with this idea that the framework, the armature we were going to build our communities around was an arterial network lined with commercial. Those days are over, and we have this amazing resource, residual, ready to come in and begin to allow for a rebirth of how we shape our cities. So there's the parcels of land, always adjacent to an arterial, coming and going from the arterial, not dragging traffic into quiet neighborhoods. There's the fire and flood. Turns out it's all clear, it's all good. This is where we want to go with the next generation of housing. And once again, if you take that part of our analysis and look at it across the water, energy, driving, and household costs. Look at that household cost number. What does it say there? It's 53% less than the average home in the Bay Area to live there in terms of transportation and utilities. 53% less. So it's inherently affordable. So now I'll get too technical, but I have to back up and kind of take away some of those images in your head. One size doesn't fit all. We can't have everybody living in 4-story podium-type buildings with ground floor shops and housing above. And so there's a whole range, dependent on lot size and what kind of arterial. We've created a matrix of housing types. And here's not. Here is stuck. Oh, it's a really nice picture too. Can we fix it? Can we fix the slides? There we go. Okay. So sometimes this is one of our kind of standalone communities. When we have an arterial, instead of putting a backyard fence and a buffer, we started building townhouses with live-work ground floor shops, and they sell like crazy. It's a great lifestyle, and it's a great way to live on a busy street. So that's one level. You start at the lowest densities on the smallest arterials, on the smallest lots, and then you step up to higher and higher densities as you get to larger parcels near transit like Caltrain on 6-lane roads. So you have a logical taxonomy. We're stuck again. Do I get extra time? Does anybody have a question at this point? I always get to this part and wonder, I think everybody knows what I'm going to say next. But the bottom line is, we skipped one there. There it is. This is another cool little street we made. 4-lane arterial, but with parking and bike lanes. Those are live-work townhouses on the right, and then higher density housing over shops beyond. The development community has no problem delivering this kind of housing now. All we need to do is entitle the land and improve the street. And I'll get into all that. And then, of course, there's brilliant stuff going on. This was the focus of SB 50, was let's think about TOD. And as the father of TOD, I love that. I just don't think we should be tearing down apartment buildings to build bigger, more expensive apartment buildings. But there are places where this kind of density on commercial land makes all the sense in the world. There's other solutions that will and should play. We have a law now for ADUs, and they are great. This is a kind of stunning, that's a map of the single-family world of the Bay Area. And if 25% of those built in-law units, that would be, 750,000 units. So that's something good. It's one market segment. They're small units, typically single people, childless couples. But they can be cute, and they help the rent, pay the rent. Now, if you, I still have stuff about SB50, even though it's now no longer running forward. And as I've already mentioned, I think the problem with SB50 was just that it leaned too heavily on converting existing residential ground, which creates a problem of gentrification and displacement intrinsically. And if it's true that we can satisfy our needs with commercial land, why go there? Why burden those neighborhoods with those screaming fights about neighbor to neighbor saying, no, I don't want a 4-story building hanging over my precious backyard. Now, you may say there's a moral imperative to transform what had been really exclusionary places. But, as Obama always says, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. And I think that we have an easier, better solution. And it's better on a bunch of other levels. Not going again. See, if I were younger, I would remember the next slide and I could tell you about it. Oh, now here's the good part. Now, hopefully the slides will roll here. We need a new generation of transit. To think we're going to get people out of their cars to get into buses that go slower than 15 miles per hour average. To think that we're going to spend over $150 million a mile to build new light rail. It's just not feasible. And I think we have a better solution. And it ain't this. Autonomous vehicles will make matters worse. They will generate more traffic and more congestion. They will be a new lease on life for ultra-distant commuting, while people are thinking, I'm just going to get in my car for the next hour and a half or 2 hours and work while I'm going. No, it's a nightmare. But a lot of Silicon Valley is invested in this technology, and I think it can be used to build the next generation of transit. So there it is, El Camino in all its beauty. You know you're in a great place when you can't tell the difference between a office building and a parking structure. But it's a huge resource, 120 feet. I know that doesn't mean a lot to you, but to me, as a planner, in 120 feet, I can do everything. I can have sidewalk cafes, I can have great sidewalks, I can have bikeways, and yes, I can have dedicated right-of-ways. The key to transit in the future is a dedicated right-of-way, so that transit has an advantage over the road, the person in their private car. Once we have those right-of-ways, I believe we can backfill with the starting answer, of course, is bus rapid transit. Works all over the world beautifully. It's the most affordable. Costs around $7 to $10 million a mile compared to $150 for light rail. And it functions pretty well. But in China, they've already got autonomous buses running more efficiently. But they still have the problem that you get on and you have to stop at every station. So that is El Camino rebuilt with 28 feet of transit way down the middle, bike lanes, and all the rest of it. It's actually a place you may want to be, as opposed to a place you may want to avoid. Now, in Singapore, they're looking at autonomous vans. And they're thinking, well, why do we have to cram everybody onto the same bus? Why don't we put them in individual buses that can nimbly go direct to destination? So in a way, every trip becomes an express trip. And with the autonomous technology viable sooner rather than later because of protected, dedicated lanes, this is the kind of thing that I can see happening very, very soon. So there's El Camino with the vans, meaning that I get in a van and I go pretty much direct to destination. We did the, here we go again. I'm so glad we preloaded this. Wrong way. There we go. Okay, totally illegible, but completely meaningful to me. Average speed goes up with this kind of next generation transit. The operations and maintenance costs go down dramatically for reasons you could think, and the construction costs are down. So something that's faster and cheaper may just be something that we can afford to do a lot of. And when we do a lot of something, well, maybe people will find it more accessible and more useful. There's new technology emerging now. Finally, personal rapid transit is starting to mature enough. And here's a group that's putting out a proposal for the Diridon Sano Airport connector. So I think that we're right on the verge of getting to the transportation solution. So there's our rail network, but that is the Grand Boulevards network. These are the places where people are living and where we could have the next generation of transit. It touches everywhere. It makes transit a local, viable, attractive transit, a local strategy. And it's all embedded in one simple idea. Take the Strip and turn it into a mixed-use Grand Boulevard with transit. All right, so I have more, but I'm going to stop because I'm out of time. Here's what we need to do. I don't think this is going to happen city by city. Certainly the circulation systems aren't going to happen. We need an as-of-right state mandate stating that commercial land will have a minimum, and there's a hierarchy. You know, it's not all 100 unit per acre stuff. You know, we can calibrate it. We're good urban designers. We can say the depth of the parcel will have an impact on the density, and that will have an impact on the first tier of houses next to it. We can step lightly and really solve the problem with very little damage. There needs to be inclusionary. If we're going to zone for 2 million more units, then the development community can step up to the plate and put in a 15% inclusionary element. The best way to handle affordable housing is to disperse it. Never collect it. Don't go in lieu. Actually have low-income populations living everywhere with everybody in every community. And we know how to do inclusionary. Here's another big one. My friend Jerry Brown took away tax increment financing. You know, the tax shift you get by doing development. And it was because redevelopment had gone a little bit off the tracks. We should bring it back for these ribbons of urbanism. If development is happening on these streets, the tax increment can be captured and bonded against to pay for the street improvements, offset the local services cost to the cities. This solves that problem of the city saying, great, it fits, but it's going to hurt my bottom line. Not if we capture that tax increment and plow it back. We need to make the transit investments, and a big chunk of it could be paid for with TIF. And there are the economic and social and environmental benefits of this kind of infill, solving the biggest challenges we have, which of course is climate change. So I will say that at the level of the state, I will stop. I'll tease you with some images here. How's this? This is LA, normative growth, LA compact, ribbon growth. I mean, these differences are what are going to create the humane and environmental viability for the next generations. We do have the solution, and I don't think it's a political non-starter. I think it's an easy win if we're unified. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Calthorpe.